I swear it's nothing, Ashley had said, a smirk on her lips as she leaned over the kitchen counter. Her eyes were fixed on her phone, her laughter echoing softly in the room. Just a silly meme from Tiffany. Terry nodded, the smile he gave her feeling forced, almost mechanical. Tiffany's got a good sense of humor, he replied, the words coming out more out of habit than genuine interest. But something gnawed at him. Ashley's tone had been off, light, but with an edge to it that he couldn't quite place. She had been texting more often lately, her phone always close by. It wasn't like before, when they'd share everything, even the most mundane details of their day. The truth was, the signs were there, subtle but unmistakable. Over the past few months, Ashley had grown distant. It wasn't just the increased texting or the private laughter. It was in the little things, the everyday moments that had once felt so connected. She was out more often, claiming she needed time with friends, or that the gym was her escape from the stress. Terry had always been supportive, encouraging her to take time for herself, but now it felt different. Her solo outings felt more like escapes from him rather than from stress. One night, she had come home late from a supposed dinner with friends. Terry was already in bed, but he'd woken up when he heard the door. He had pretended to be asleep, his breathing slow and steady, as he listened to her quietly tiptoe through the house. There was something in the way she moved, as if she was trying too hard not to wake him. She slid into bed beside him, her movements careful and deliberate. The scent of perfume lingered, one he didn't recognize, and it clung to her skin like an accusation. The next morning, Terry had asked her how the dinner was. It was fun, she'd said with a casual shrug. We just talked. Nothing special. She had smiled at him, but it didn't reach her eyes. Terry had brushed off his suspicions, convincing himself that he was being paranoid. After all, they'd been together for nearly 2 decades. They had weathered storms, financial struggles, family crises, even the occasional rough patch in their relationship. Why would she stray now? He threw himself into his work, burying his doubts under a mountain of files and deadlines. The firm had been pushing him hard, and he was determined to secure the promotion that would finally give them the financial freedom they had always talked about. He wanted to give Ashley everything she deserved. He thought he was doing the right thing, working hard for their future. The long hours at the office became a convenient excuse to ignore the growing distance between them. He hadn't noticed when Ashley started staying up late, long after he had gone to bed. She claimed she was catching up on her favorite shows or reading, but when he'd pass by the living room, her laptop would be open. The screen quickly switched as soon as she sensed his presence. You should get some sleep, he had said one night, pausing by the doorway. You've got work in the morning. I know, she'd replied without looking up. Just a few more minutes. But those few minutes stretched into hours, and more often than not, he'd wake up in the middle of the night to find her side of the bed empty. On weekends, they used to go hiking together, exploring the trails near their home. It was their time to disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other. But lately, even those hikes felt different. Ashley seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere, as if the beautiful landscapes around them held no interest for her anymore. Everything okay? Terry asked one Saturday, as they walked along a familiar trail. Yeah, just tired, she'd replied, her eyes scanning the treetops. Work's been draining lately. He had accepted her answer, not wanting to push. But there was a hollow feeling in his chest, a sense that they were losing something they couldn't easily get back. Despite these changes, Terry clung to the belief that they were just going through a phase. Every couple had rough patches, he told himself. They'd bounce back. They always had. But then, there were the phone calls. Ashley had always been casual with her phone, leaving it lying around the house. But now, it was never out of her sight. She'd answer calls in another room, her voice low and hushed. When Terry asked who it was, she'd give vague answers, just a friend, or work stuff. It wasn't like her, and it set his nerves on edge. One evening, after Ashley had gone to bed, Terry sat in the living room, the TV on mute. Her phone was charging on the coffee table, and for the first time, he felt an overwhelming urge to check it. His hands itched to pick it up, to scroll through the messages and find out who she had been talking to. But he didn't. Instead, he sat there, staring at the screen, feeling a mix of guilt and frustration. He had never been the jealous type, but now doubt was seeping into his thoughts like poison. The final straw came on last night when Terry woke up in the middle of the night, the bed cold beside him. He found Ashley in the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. She didn't hear him approach, and for a moment, he stood there, hidden in the shadows, listening. "I'll see you tomorrow then," she whispered, her voice soft and affectionate. Same time, Terry's heart pounded in his chest. He stepped forward, making just enough noise for her to notice. Ashley jumped, spinning around to face him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Terry," she said, her voice shaky. "What are you doing up?" "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, his voice calm but with an edge that hadn't been there before. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the phone. "I was just talking to Tiffany. She couldn't sleep, so we were chatting." Terry nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Right, Tiffany." Ashley's face flushed, and she quickly ended the call, setting the phone down on the counter. "I'm coming to bed," she said, brushing past him without meeting his gaze. Terry stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to confront her. Not yet. He returned to bed, lying awake in the dark, listening to the sound of Ashley's breathing beside him. The distance between them felt like a chasm, one that he wasn't sure they could ever bridge again. The early signs were there, but Terry had chosen to ignore them, to hold on to the belief that their love was stronger than any doubt or suspicion. But deep down, he knew that something had changed, and he couldn't shake the feeling that their marriage was slipping through his fingers. And then, everything changed. Terry's Saturday had started like any other. He woke up early, kissed Ashley on the forehead as she slept, and slipped out of bed quietly. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow through the windows as he got dressed. "Another Saturday," he muttered to himself, grabbing his keys from the dresser. Ashley mumbled something in her sleep, but Terry didn't catch it. He paused, looking back at her peaceful face. "Sleep well," he whispered, before heading out the door. He met his friends at the usual spot, a small diner on the outskirts of town. The place had been their go-to for years, a sanctuary where they could catch up and unwind. As he walked in, the familiar scent of coffee and bacon greeted him. "There he is." Tom, his oldest friend, called out from a booth near the back. "Finally decided to join us, huh?" Terry smiled, sliding into the booth. "Yeah, figured I'd make time for the important things," he joked, though he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did. They talked about work, old memories, and the latest town gossip. Tom teased him about being a workaholic. "Dave, you should cut out early more often. You're always so buried in work," Tom said, pouring syrup over his pancakes. Terry chuckled, picking at his omelet. "Maybe I will. It's been a while since I just took a day to relax." But even as he laughed with his friends, his thoughts kept drifting back to Ashley. He hadn't been spending as much time with her lately. Work had taken over his life, and he realized just how much he missed the simple moments with her. The nights they spent watching movies, the quiet dinners, even the mundane routines of daily life. He couldn't remember the last time they just talked, really talked, without distractions. As the morning wore on, Terry felt a growing urge to go home. The conversation at the table became background noise as he thought about surprising Ashley. Maybe they could spend the afternoon together, do something spontaneous. It had been too long since they'd had one of those carefree days. "I'm heading out," Terry said suddenly, standing up from the booth. "Got some things I want to take care of." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Already? We just got started." "Yeah, but I'm thinking of surprising Ashley. We've been missing each other lately with all the work I've been doing," Terry explained, fishing out his wallet. "Look at you, Mr. Romantic," Tom teased, grinning. "Go on then. We'll see you next week." Terry left some cash on the table and waved goodbye to his friends. "See you guys next week," he called out as he walked out the door. The drive home was peaceful. It was a perfect day for a surprise. He could almost see the smile on Ashley's face when she saw him come home early. But as he pulled into the driveway, something felt off. Ashley's car was there, parked as usual, but the house was eerily quiet. No music, no TV, nothing. He frowned, turning off the engine. Maybe she's napping, he thought as he grabbed his keys and got out of the car. He walked up to the front door, unlocking it slowly, trying not to make too much noise. The house was still and silent as he stepped inside. The living room was empty, the kitchen spotless. He called out her name. "Ashley," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. There was no response. Terry's brow furrowed as he moved further into the house. He checked the bedroom, empty. The bathroom, the guest room, both empty. He was about to call her when he saw it. Her phone, lying on the kitchen counter, buzzing softly. Terry's heart skipped a beat. Ashley never left her phone out like that, especially not when she was out. He walked over, his hand hesitating above the phone as it buzzed again. Another incoming call from someone named Tiffany. His stomach churned. Ashley had mentioned Tiffany before, but why would she be calling now, when Ashley wasn't around to answer? The phone stopped buzzing, the screen going dark. Terry stood there, staring at it, the silence of the house pressing down on him. Then, the phone buzzed again, this time with a message notification. Terry hesitated, but the buzzing continued, each vibration resonating in his chest. He picked up the phone, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked it. The first thing he noticed was that the last message wasn't from Tiffany. It was from someone named Luther, and the words on the screen made his blood run cold. "Can't wait to see you again. Same time today?" Terry stared at the message, his mind racing. Luther? He didn't know any Luther other than his neighbor. His heart pounded in his chest, the pieces slowly falling into place. His hands clenched around the phone as he read the message again. "See you again." The words echoed in his mind, a confirmation of what he had feared but never wanted to believe. His thoughts were a jumble, confusion and anger swirling together, each feeding the other. He wanted to call her, to demand answers, but something stopped him. Instead, he found himself turning towards the back door, a strange, nagging feeling pulling him outside. Then he heard it, a faint noise coming from somewhere outside. It was the unmistakable sound of water splashing, but that didn't make sense. His neighbors, the Halls, were out of town for the weekend. Who could be in their pool? Terry frowned, stepping outside to investigate. As he walked around the side of the house, the noise grew louder, but it wasn't just splashing anymore. There were other sounds mixed in, soft moaning, laughter, and muffled voices. Each step felt heavier than the last as he approached the fence separating his yard from the neighbors. His pulse quickened, a sickening feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. The pool? But the neighbors are out of town. Terry's thoughts spiraled as he reached the fence. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. Then, with a deep breath, he peered over the fence. His world stopped. "What the hell?" he muttered to himself, peering over the fence. There, in the neighbor's pool, was Ashley. Her back was pressed against the edge, her arms lazily draped around the shoulders of a man. Terry's heart nearly stopped when he recognized him. Luther, the neighbor who lived in their lane. The one who had always seemed a little too friendly, was with her. They were both completely naked, their bodies glistening in the sunlight as they moved together in the water. Terry felt like he'd been punched in the gut. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't think. He wanted to look away, to turn back and pretend he hadn't seen it, but his eyes were locked on the scene before him. His whole world had just shattered in an instant, the reality of what he was seeing sinking in like a lead weight. Ashley's eyes met his, and for a moment, everything froze. Her expression shifted from relaxed to one of pure horror, her face draining of color as she realized they had been caught. She scrambled to move away from Luther, her hands trembling as she tried to cover herself. But Luther, that smug bastard, didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his head slowly towards Terry, a grin spreading across his face. It was the kind of grin that said he didn't care, that he had no regrets, and that he was relishing the situation. "Hey there, Terry," Luther called out, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I found a way to beat the heat using your wife. Want to join?" The words were like a dagger twisting in Terry's heart. The sheer audacity of the man, standing there so casually, as if he hadn't just destroyed Terry's life, left him paralyzed with shock. He could barely process the situation, the betrayal so blatant, so brazen, that it felt like something out of a nightmare. Terry stood there, frozen, as his mind struggled to catch up with what was happening. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. His chest tightened, a mix of rage, hurt, and disbelief swirling inside him. How long had this been going on? How could Ashley do this to him? His eyes shifted back to Ashley, who was now frantically trying to distance herself from Luther, her expression pleading. "Terry, it's not what it looks like," she stammered, her voice shaking. "Please let me explain." Terry's mind was a blur. He felt detached, like he was watching the scene unfold from outside his own body. But as Ashley's words hit him, something inside him snapped. The rage that had been building, simmering beneath the surface, finally boiled over. "Not what it looks like?" Terry repeated, his voice cold and flat. "Not what it looks like?" He couldn't believe she was even trying to talk her way out of this, as if there could be any explanation that would make this okay. He took a step closer to the fence, his hands gripping the top of it so tightly his knuckles turned white. Luther didn't back down. If anything, his grin widened, enjoying the chaos he had caused. "Come on, Terry. We're all adults here. Let's not make this a big deal." The condescension in Luther's tone was the final straw. Terry felt a surge of fury, his vision going red as he moved towards the gate that connected their yards. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't just stand there and take this. He had to act. Ashley's voice trembled as she called out to him again. "Terry, please, just listen to me." She was out of the pool now, wrapping herself in a towel, her wet hair clinging to her face. But Terry didn't want to hear it. He couldn't bear to hear her lies, her excuses. As he reached the gate, he threw it open with a force that made it slam against the fence. Luther's grin finally faltered, realizing that Terry was not in the mood for jokes. He backed away slightly, raising his hands in a mock gesture of surrender. "Whoa, take it easy, man," Luther said, his tone shifting slightly, though the arrogance still lingered in his voice. "No need to get violent." Terry ignored him, his focus solely on Ashley. "How long?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper, but the intensity in it made Ashley flinch. She hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. "Terry, I asked how long, bitch?" Terry repeated, each word cutting through the air like a knife. Ashley's lips quivered as she struggled to find the words. "It's not what you think," he slapped her across the face. "Don't lie to me." Terry roared, his voice echoing across the yard. "How long has this been going on?" Ashley's eyes welled up with tears, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his anger. "A few months," she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. Terry felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. A few months? The betrayal was deeper than he had imagined. Every moment of the past few months replayed in his mind, every late night, every lie, every time she had looked him in the eye and pretended that everything was fine. "I gave you everything," Terry said, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I worked so hard for us, for our future. And this is how you repay me?" Ashley's tears flowed freely now, her guilt and regret written all over her face. "I'm so sorry, Terry," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you. You just what?" Terry snapped, his patience gone. "You just decided to throw everything away? For what? For him?" He shot a venomous glance at Luther, who had the sense to look away, but Terry wasn't done. "You disgust me," he spat, his words dripping with contempt. His hands clenched into fists, his whole body trembling with rage. He wanted to hit something, anything, to release the anger that was threatening to consume him. "Terry, please, let's forget this," she began, her voice trembling with desperation. But Terry cut her off with a glare so cold that the words died in her throat. His eyes, usually so full of warmth and love, were now filled with a fury she had never seen before. She took a step back, instinctively knowing that any further protest would be futile, maybe even dangerous. Luther, still in the pool, tried to play it cool, his grin unwavering. He was the kind of guy who believed he could talk his way out of anything, and this situation was no different in his mind. Come on, man. Don't make this a big deal. We were just having a bit of fun. Fun? Terry's voice was dangerously quiet, the words dripping with barely contained rage. You think this is fun? Before Luther could react, Terry lunged at him. His hands shot out, grabbing Luther by the throat with a grip like iron. The force of the attack sent waves splashing over the pool's edge as Terry shoved Luther underwater. Luther's eyes bulged in terror, his arms flailing wildly as he struggled against Terry's grip. His initial confidence evaporated, replaced with sheer panic as he realized the seriousness of the situation. He kicked and thrashed, trying to break free, but Terry's strength was fueled by a rage that gave him an almost inhuman power. Ashley screamed, a shrill, desperate sound that echoed through the yard. She scrambled out of the pool, water dripping from her body as she stood frozen, too terrified to move. She wanted to stop him, to do something, but her body refused to obey. All she could do was watch in horror as the man she loved tried to drown her lover. Terry's grip tightened, his knuckles white as he held Luther under the water. He could see the bubbles rising to the surface, hear the muffled sounds of Luther's struggle growing weaker. But he didn't let go. Not yet. He wanted Luther to feel the fear, to know that he was completely at Terry's mercy. Finally, just as Luther's flailing had almost stopped, Terry released him. Luther shot up from the water, gasping and choking. His body racked with violent coughs as he desperately tried to fill his lungs with air. He clawed at the pool's edge, struggling to pull himself out, but Terry wasn't done. Not by a long shot. With a swift, merciless motion, Terry grabbed Luther by the hair, yanking him out of the pool and onto the hard ground. Luther yelped in pain, his body collapsing in a wet, shivering heap at Terry's feet. He tried to push himself up, but Terry was on him in an instant, dragging him across the yard towards the shed. Ashley, still shaking and crying, reached out, her voice cracking with fear and regret. Terry, please, stop this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But Terry ignored her. His mind was a dark, singular tunnel, focused only on one thing: making them pay for what they had done. He didn't care about her tears, her apologies. They were meaningless to him now. The woman he had loved, the life they had built together, all of it was a lie. And now, it was time to tear it all down. He kicked open the shed door, dragging Luther inside and throwing him to the ground. The shed was filled with tools, gardening equipment, old furniture, and other odds and ends. But Terry's eyes landed on the tool bench, where a collection of sharp, gleaming instruments hung in neat rows. Luther groaned, trying to crawl away, but Terry grabbed a nearby rope, quickly binding Luther's hands behind his back. Luther squirmed, his voice hoarse from the near drowning. Terry, man, you don't have to do this. We can talk about this. Terry yanked the rope tight, cutting off Luther's protests. Shut up, he hissed, his voice low and menacing. You don't get to talk. Not anymore. He stood up, surveying the shed's contents, his mind racing through the possibilities. He wanted to hurt Luther, to make him feel every ounce of pain and humiliation that he had caused. His hand hovered over a rusty hammer, then moved to a pair of pruning shears. But as his fingers brushed against a heavy wrench, he paused, a dark smile spreading across his face. This would do. He turned back to Luther, who was now slumped against the wall, his face pale and streaked with water. You like to play games, don't you, Luther? Terry said, his tone eerily calm. Well, let's see how you like this one. Ashley appeared in the doorway, her face pale as she watched Terry lift the wrench. Terry, please no, she pleaded, her voice barely more than a whisper. Terry shot her a look so full of anger that it made her recoil. Get out, he snarled, pointing towards the house. I don't want to see your face. Tears streamed down Ashley's cheeks as she backed away, her body shaking with sobs. She knew she had lost him, completely, irrevocably, and that whatever came next would change their lives forever. But she couldn't bring herself to leave. She stayed there, just outside the shed, her heart pounding as she waited for what would happen next. Inside, Terry turned his attention back to Luther, who was staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Please, Terry, don't," Luther started to say, but Terry cut him off with a swift kick to the ribs. "You should have thought about that before you touched her," Terry growled, raising the wrench high above his head. The first blow landed with a sickening thud, followed by a sharp cry of pain from Luther. Terry didn't stop. He brought the wrench down again and again, each strike fueled by the betrayal, the anger, and the overwhelming need for revenge. Luther's screams echoed through the yard, but Terry didn't hear them. He was lost in his own world, a world where nothing existed but the sound of metal on flesh and the satisfaction of seeing the man who had wronged him suffer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Terry stopped, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked down at Luther, who was barely conscious, blood pooling around him on the dirt floor. Terry's hands were covered in blood, the wrench slick with it, but he didn't feel anything. No remorse, no regret. Just an empty, hollow sense of finality. He tossed the wrench aside, the clatter of metal on wood breaking the silence. Ashley was fainted on the ground. As he left there, he didn't look back. The life he had known was over. All that was left was the darkness of the path he had chosen. Hours later, the scene was a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted earlier. The police arrived, responding to the frantic call of a terrified woman. The once peaceful suburban neighborhood was now a hive of activity, with flashing lights illuminating the night. Officers moved quickly but cautiously, their expressions grim as they assessed the situation. Luther was found first, bound and bruised, barely conscious, tied to a chair in the shed. His face was swollen, dried blood caked around his nose and mouth. He was alive, but just barely. The paramedics who arrived shortly after began their work, stabilizing him as best they could before preparing to transport him to the hospital. Ashley was on the ground outside the shed, still naked, her body shivering uncontrollably despite the blanket that a kind officer had draped over her shoulders. She was a mess of tears and incoherent words, sobbing uncontrollably. Her hands clutched at the blanket as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. "Ma'am, can you tell us what happened?" an officer asked gently, kneeling beside her. Ashley shook her head, her voice a broken whisper. "It's my fault. It's all my fault." She couldn't bring herself to say more, her mind a blur of guilt and terror. Terry, however, was a different story. He was found sitting in his yard, his clothes soaked from the pool and stained with blood. His knuckles were raw, a telltale sign of the violence he had unleashed, but his face was expressionless, his eyes staring off into the distance as if he were somewhere far away. "Sir, what happened here?" one of the officers asked cautiously, glancing between the broken man in the shed and the empty look in Terry's eyes. Terry didn't respond immediately. He felt numb, as if he were outside of his own body, watching everything from a distance. The weight of what he had done was beginning to settle on him, a cold, heavy feeling that pressed down on his chest. Finally, he spoke, his voice hollow and devoid of emotion. "I found my wife cheating on me," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue, like they belonged to someone else. "I came home early and found them like this." The officer exchanged a look with his partner before approaching Terry carefully. "We're going to need to take you in for questioning, sir," he said gently, his tone calm and measured. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" Terry shook his head, barely registering the words. "No, I'm fine," he muttered, his gaze fixed on a spot somewhere beyond the officer's shoulder. "Just take them away. I don't want to see their faces anymore." As the officers moved to escort Terry to the waiting patrol car, he glanced back one last time at the house he had shared with Ashley, at the life they had built together. The garden where they had spent so many peaceful afternoons, the living room where they had shared countless evenings watching movies, the bedroom that had once been a sanctuary of love and trust. It was all over now, destroyed in an instant by betrayal and the uncontrollable fury that had followed. The ride to the police station was a blur. Terry sat in the back of the patrol car, staring out the window as the streets passed by in a haze of streetlights and shadows. His mind was numb, his thoughts disjointed, unable to settle on any one thing for more than a moment. All he could see was the image of Ashley and Luther in the pool, their bodies entwined in the most intimate of betrayals. And then the blood, so much blood, staining his hands, his clothes, his soul. At the station, Terry was led into an interrogation room, a dark, sterile space with a metal table and 2 chairs. The officers left him alone for what felt like hours, the silence pressing in on him, amplifying the thoughts he was trying so hard to suppress. When they finally returned, it was with a detective, a middle-aged man with a tired face and a weary look in his eyes. "Terry, I'm Detective Harris," the man said as he took a seat across from him. "I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions about what happened tonight." Terry nodded slowly, barely hearing the words. He knew this was coming, knew that he would have to recount the events that had led to this moment. But now that it was here, he didn't know where to begin. How could he explain the rage that had consumed him, the overwhelming need for revenge that had driven him to the edge? "You said you came home early and found your wife with another man," Detective Harris prompted, his voice steady but not unkind. "Can you tell me what happened after that?" Terry swallowed hard, his throat dry. I lost it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw them together, and I lost control. I didn't plan any of this. I didn't even know I was capable of something like this." The detective nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Did you intend to kill him, Terry?" he asked, his tone careful. Terry shook his head vigorously. "No, I wanted him to feel what I was feeling. I wanted him to suffer for what he did to me, to us." His voice cracked, the weight of his actions finally breaking through the numbness. "But I didn't mean for it to go this far." Harris leaned back in his chair, studying Terry for a long moment. "I'm not here to judge you, Terry," he said quietly, "but I need to understand what happened. Every detail matters." Terry took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to relive the events of the evening. The moment he had found them, the confrontation, the violence that had followed. He recounted everything in as much detail as he could, his voice monotone as he described the rage, the physical struggle, and the cold detachment that had taken over as he exacted his revenge. When he finished, the room fell into a heavy silence. Detective Harris remained silent for a moment, processing what he had just heard. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Terry, based on what you've told me, we're going to have to charge you with murder, assault, and possibly more depending on what happens with Luther. Do you understand that?" Terry nodded numbly. "I understand," he said, his voice barely audible. He felt a crushing weight settle on his chest, the full realization of what he had done beginning to sink in. His life, as he knew it, was over. There was no going back from this. As the detective stood to leave, Terry called out to him, his voice hoarse. "What's going to happen to her? To Ashley?" Harris paused at the door, turning back to look at him. "She'll be taken care of," he said simply. "But you need to focus on your own situation now, Terry. This isn't going to be easy, but it's the path you chose." Terry nodded, his eyes dropping to the table in front of him. The road ahead was uncertain, darkened by the shadow of what he had done. He knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The man who had walked into his home earlier that day was gone, replaced by someone he barely recognized. As the door closed behind the detective, Terry leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He was alone now, truly alone, and the only thing he could do was wait for whatever came next.